Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Build Business Better. I'm your host for today, Courtney Morningstar. I want to tell you a story today because I think it illustrates something we see all the time at Enterprise Sage. The names and details have been changed to protect the client. But if you've spent any time in the construction industry, you'll probably recognize this business. You may even recognize yourself. No, I don't think we'll call this one Mark. Let's call the owner Rick. Rick ran a commercial construction company that had been around for almost 30 years. They had a great reputation, around 45 employees, plenty of work, and they were booked well into the following year. If you drove around town, there was a good chance you'd eventually pass one of Rick's projects. A medical office, a warehouse, maybe a school or municipal building. His company wasn't flashy, but they were well respected. And in construction, that's worth a lot. Like most contractors, Rick measured success by how busy everybody was. The phones were ringing, crews were working Saturdays, the backlog was full, and every project manager was convinced they needed one more superintendent yesterday. If you've ever sat through a construction operations meeting, you know exactly what I'm talking about. One day, a buyer approached him. He hadn't put the company on market. He wasn't actively looking to retire. But when someone asks if your business is for sale, it's hard not to wonder what all of those years of 14-hour days might actually be worth. So he took the meeting. The offer came back lower than he had ever expected. Not offensively low. It wasn't the kind of offer that makes you walk away from the table. It was just disappointing. After 30 years of growing a respected company, he honestly believed the business was worth significantly more. That's when someone suggested he talk to Enterprise Sage. One of the first conversations we had wasn't about selling the company at all. It was about understanding why buyers saw the business differently than Rick did, because that's a question almost every owner eventually has to answer. See, from Rick's perspective, everything looked healthy. Revenue was strong, jobs kept coming in, and they had more work than they could comfortably take on. But buyers don't value busyness. They value predictability. They value transferable systems. They value businesses that can keep producing results after the founder walks away. Those are very different things. As we started digging into the business, something became obvious almost immediately. Rick was the estimating department. He was the final approval on every proposal. He negotiated the big contracts. He solved the problems in the field. If a superintendent hit an issue on site, they called Rick. If a client wanted something changed, they called Rick. If a supplier had a question, they called Rick. I finally laughed and asked him, out of curiosity, what would happen if you disappeared for 3 weeks? Without missing a beat, he said, I'd come back to about 200 voicemails. He meant it as a joke. I didn't. Because that's exactly what a buyer sees. They don't see a company that's running itself. They see a company that's completely dependent on one person. And if the value of the company walks out the door on closing day, they're not going to pay a premium for it. That's when Rick started realizing we weren't there to help him sell his business. We were there to help him build a business that someone would actually want to buy. One of the first things we do with any business is forget the financial statements for a minute and just try to understand how the company actually runs. You'd be surprised how much you can learn just by listening. So we sat down with Rick and started talking through a normal week. Not his best week, not the version he'd tell his banker, just a regular Tuesday. Within about 20 minutes, a pattern started to emerge. Rick estimated every major project himself. He reviewed every proposal before it went out the door. If a bid needed to be sharpened by 0.5% to beat another contractor, everyone waited for Rick. Then we'd ask about operations. Who approves change orders? Me. Who handles owner meetings when someone goes sideways? Usually me. What happens if a superintendent needs another crew or has a scheduling issue? They'll call me. By the time we'd gone through estimating, project management, purchasing, scheduling, and client relationships, I looked at him and said, Rick, do you realize you're doing about 6 full-time jobs? He laughed and said, yeah, but that's construction. And to be fair, he's not entirely wrong. Construction has always attracted people who pride themselves on solving problems. Most owners didn't wake up one morning and decide they wanted to run a business. They were great builders who eventually hired enough people that they accidentally became CEOs. That's a very different skill set. The problem is that somewhere along the way, being indispensable starts feeling like success. I have to tell you, it isn't. It's exhausting. And eventually it becomes expensive. One thing I've learned is that construction owners wear business almost like a badge of honor. If you're answering calls at 6 in the morning, walking jobs until 5, doing estimates until dinner, and returning emails after everyone else has gone to bed, people assume you are super successful. The reality is, you might just be carrying a business that never learned how to stand on its own. Rick wasn't lazy by any means, quite the opposite. He cared deeply about every project, every customer, and every employee. That's what had made him successful in the first place. But the same habits that helped him build the company were now limiting what the company was actually worth. That became even clearer when we started looking at job costing. I asked him a question I ask almost every contractor. What's your most profitable project this year? He gave me the name of a school they just finished. I asked, how do you know? He smiled and said, well, because we made good money on it. I said, no, how do you know? That's when the room got really quiet. See, there's a difference between feeling like a job went well and having the numbers to prove it. A lot of contractors know exactly how much cash is sitting in the bank. They know what payroll is on Friday. They know what steel prices did this month. But ask them which type of project consistently produces the highest margins or which PM is quietly outperforming everyone else, and suddenly it becomes a guessing game. That's not because they're bad operators. It's because they're busy building. And when you're running from bid walks to OAC meetings to put out fires in the field, it's easy to convince yourself you'll dig into the numbers next week. The problem is next week turns into next quarter, then next year. Before long, you've completed 100 jobs without ever really learning which ones made you money and which ones just kept your crews busy. A buyer notices that. They don't just want to see revenue. They want to understand how predictable your profits are. Can this company consistently estimate work? Can it protect margins? Can it manage change orders? Can it finish jobs without the owner personally solving every crisis? Those answers have a much bigger impact on value than most owners realize. And that's when Rick started to understand something that changed the entire conversation. He didn't have a construction problem. He had a business problem. Hey, but you know what? The good news? Business problems can be fixed. At that point, Rick looked at me and said something I will never forget. So, where do we even start? Honestly, that's my favorite question. Because by the time an owner asks that, they've stopped defending the way they've always been doing things. They're ready to build something better. And the first thing I told him probably wasn't what he expected. I said, we're not going to start by trying to sell your business. He kind of looked at me sideways. I said, we're going to build a business that buyers compete over. Those are two completely different goals. Selling a business is an event. Building value is a process. So instead of talking about exit strategies, we started talking about Monday morning. What has to happen next week to make this company a little less dependent on you? That was our lens for every decision. The first priority was getting Rick out of the middle of everything. Not because he wasn't good at it. Oh, he was good at it. That was actually the problem. He'd become so good at solving problems that everyone had learned to stop solving them for themselves. I've never met a contractor who lacked optimism, and I've heard all sorts of fairy tales like, I'm going to catch up on all my contracts during the Christmas break. But the problem was that every question eventually found its way back to Rick. Every decision waited on Rick. Every fire ended up on Rick's desk. And that's exhausting for an owner, but it's also a huge red flag for a buyer. So we started pushing decisions back into the organization. Estimators got clearer. Pricing guardrails instead of waiting for Rick to review every bid. Project managers were given measurable authority over schedules, budgets, and subcontractor decisions. Superintendents knew when they could make the call themselves and when they needed to escalate. It wasn't about removing Rick. It was about creating confidence throughout the company, even though Rick loved being in the fire department. Because buyers don't pay for more heroic owners. They pay more for capable teams. The next thing we tackled was visibility. See, construction companies generate mountains of information every single day. Daily reports, RFIs, submittals, schedule updates, pay applications, job cost reports. The challenge usually isn't a lack of information. It's knowing which numbers actually matter. So together, we built a scorecard. Not 100 KPIs that nobody was ever going to look at. Just the handful of metrics that told us whether the business was becoming healthier. Were estimates turning into profitable jobs? Were gross margins improving? How long were change orders sitting before they were approved? Which project managers consistently protected profit? Which customers paid on time? Where was cash getting tied up? Those conversations changed everything. Instead of reacting to problems after they showed up, Rick and his leadership team started spotting trends before they became expensive. One of the biggest wins came from something almost every contractor struggles with: customer concentration. One developer represented nearly half the company's revenue. Now, that's a great relationship to have until it isn't. Markets change, projects get postponed, financing dries up, developers shift priorities. None of that is unusual in construction. What matters is whether your business can absorb it. So rather than chasing more work from the same customer, we helped Rick create a growth strategy that diversified his client base over the next couple of years. Was it slower? Oh, absolutely. Was it worth it? Every single buyer thought so. We also spent a lot of time talking about something owners rarely think about while they're busy running jobs: enterprise value. Most contractors know how to build a building, but very few know what actually drives the value of the company they're building. Revenue is only part of the story. Profit matters. Cash flow matters. But buyers are really buying confidence. Confidence that the leadership team can execute. Confidence that systems are repeatable. Confidence that customers will stay. Confidence that profits aren't dependent on one person's experience or relationships. Now, once Rick understood that, the conversation changed completely. He stopped asking, "How much is my business worth today?" He started asking, "What would make it worth more 2 years from now?" Bingo! Those are the kinds of questions that create real wealth. Because every improvement we made wasn't just making the company easier to run. It was making the company more attractive to someone writing a very large check. That's the part most owners miss. See, the value of a business isn't created in the conference room when the purchase agreements get signed. It's actually created years beforehand in hundreds of small decisions that reduced risk, improve consistency, and prove that the business can thrive without the founder carrying it on their shoulders every day. That's exactly what we set out to build with Rick. A couple of years later, Rick sold the company, not because he was burned out, not because he had to, because he finally had options. And that's a completely different place to negotiate from. The interesting part wasn't that the company sold for more than the original offer, although it did. It was why. The buyers weren't looking at a company that depended on one guy answering his phone from every job site in town. They saw a leadership team that could run the business systems they could trust, healthy margins, and a company that had a future beyond its founder. That's what they were willing to pay for. You know, one of my favorite moments came a few months ago after the sale. Rick called me and said, "You know what I did this morning?" And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Nothing." Now, if you've owned a construction company for 30 years, nothing is a pretty big accomplishment. He wasn't reviewing submittals. He wasn't arguing over a change order. He wasn't trying to figure out why the concrete crew showed up before the forms were finished, or why someone swore they thought the permit had already been approved. He was having coffee on his back porch with his wife on a Tuesday morning. He laughed and said, "I don't really know what people do on Tuesdays." I told him most people don't spend them chasing lien waivers. We both had a good laugh. And honestly, that's what success looked like for him. It wasn't the wire transfer. It wasn't the closing dinner. It was finally getting his time back. That's something we don't talk about enough. Most owners tell me they want to sell for the money. Yeah, who doesn't? What they really want, though, is freedom. Freedom to travel. Freedom to spend time with their family. Freedom to spoil the grandkids. Freedom to sleep through the night without wondering if a crane broke down or whether someone remembered to order enough rebar. And here's the irony. The owners who build businesses that give them freedom before they sell are usually the same owners who get the highest offers when they finally do. That's not a coincidence. So let me leave you with one thought. If your business can't run for 2 weeks without you, you don't own a business yet. You own a very demanding job with excellent branding. And if your phone rings every time someone can't find a tape measure, we should probably talk. Seriously though, you don't have to fix everything overnight. Nobody does. The companies that create extraordinary value aren't built in one big push. They're built one decision at a time. One better process, one stronger leader, one smarter financial decision, one less dependency on the owner. That's exactly what Enterprise Sage exists to help business owners do. Whether you're planning to sell next year, 10 years from now, or you're simply tired of feeling like the business owns you instead of the other way around, the first step is understanding where you stand today. And that's why we offer a free business valuation on our website. It's straightforward. It only takes about 18 questions, and it gives you a clearer picture of what's adding value to your business and what might be quietly holding it back. No pressure, no obligation, really, just information that can help you make better decisions today. Because here's the truth. Someday, you'll sign your last change order. You'll walk your last job site. You'll finish your last OAC meeting. The only question is whether all those years of early mornings, late nights, weather delays, budget meetings, and while you're here, can you just conversations will turn into the retirement you've earned. I really hope they do. And thanks for spending a little time with me today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with another contractor who still thinks being booked solid automatically means they're building wealth. Until next time, keep building great companies, not just great projects. We'll see you on the next episode of Build Business Better. Bye-bye.